There is one detail about his life that almost everyone misses, and that tiny detail changed everything. This is not a story about luck, not about pedigree, and not about a sudden breakthrough. It is about a mindset that looked mundane until you saw it work like a lever. Picture a small brass compass, rounded and worn, that he kept in his jacket pocket for 25 years. Not a fancy trophy, not a bank statement, but a compass that pointed his decisions when everything else seemed to spin. He was 35 the first time someone laughed at him for carrying it. Most people that age worry about titles and appearances. He worried about direction. He grew up in a one-room apartment where the heater clicked like a tired clock and the smell of fried onions mixed with damp winter air. He learned early that scarcity makes you small and habits make you big. He did not inherit a company. He did not inherit capital. He inherited a single rule from his grandmother Maria, and that rule looked like a stubborn grain of sand until it became a pearl of method. The promise of this video is simple. You will leave with 3 principles you can apply today, some rituals you can start this week, and a question that will change the way you use your time. If you want to commit, write in the comments, "My new habit is," and name the small action you will take. Now let me tell you the story from the beginning, because the smallest object can map the largest destiny. He was named Elias when the city still felt like a river of open markets and unpaved alleys. His father Thomas left when Elias was 6, and his mother Alina worked 2 jobs. She mended coats in the morning and sold pastries in the evenings. The kitchen table smelled of sugar and shoe polish, and the radio played news that felt distant. As a boy, Elias learned the weight of coins by touch and the meaning of shame when he could not buy his sister Priya a school notebook. At night, he would hold the brass compass Maria had given him the day he promised to always choose a path toward learning and toward service. That promise was more ritual than superstition. He would spin the compass in his palm and whisper 3 questions that would become his inner architecture. What did I do that moved me toward the person I want to be? What distracted me? And what single small thing will I do tomorrow? Those 3 questions were 10 minutes of discipline each day, and they rewired the kind of decisions he made. The backstory matters because it shows the origin of the ritual and connects to the conflict later. When he was 15, he sold pastries with Elena on street corners while reading books about accounting at night. He felt the grit of the coin ridges under his thumb and the paper smell of old library books. He memorized the sound of the vendor bell and the cadence of the city footsteps, and these sensory memories anchored his resolve. He did not sleep in a bed of privilege. He slept in a bed of purpose, and the difference mattered. Later in his 20s, he worked for a small logistics firm under the supervision of Robert, an exacting manager who taught him the value of measurement. Robert made him tally delivery times and mark losses with red ink and praise with green. Elias learned to make invisible problems visible. The compass orients not because it points north, but because it forces a pause that turns intention into measurement and measurement into momentum. Imagine a garden left fallow for years. You can shout at the weeds, or you can start a ritual every Sunday of laying a single seed, watering for 5 minutes, and clearing a patch with your own hands. Over months, the garden does not just become green, it becomes yours. That metaphor holds across finance, relationships, leadership, and work. What followed for Elias were rituals that looked small to everyone else and decisive in his own life. He instituted 4 daily habits that he called the compass rituals. He woke at 5 every morning to write 10 lines of what he valued and what he feared. He walked to the nearest park and listened with his eyes closed to 3 sounds he had not noticed: the first stream of morning traffic, the distant cry of a street vendor, and the rustle of leaves. He logged every expense in a slim notebook and reviewed the ledger on Sundays. He gave away 1% of income even when income was a rumor, and he reinvested any surplus into learning. These are simple words, but the sensory detail matters when you perform them. The notebook smelt faintly of coffee, it had pencil indentations, and the pages creaked in a way that matched the creak of the city wooden door. Those rituals created a rhythm that made complicated choices optional and obvious choices inevitable. The first real test came when Elias pitched his idea for a small logistics platform to a bank for a microloan. That meeting became the moment when the compass was no longer a symbol, but a negotiation tool. The scene is worth hearing because conversations make principles real, and because I want you to feel the texture of the moment. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the scratch of pens on paper, the clean scent of the bank coffee, and the faint metallic sensation of a coin in your pocket. The bank officer was named Sandra. The loan officer smiled in a way that weighed risk. The interlocutors were Elias, Sandra, and a skeptical board member named Daniel. And beside them sat a young lawyer named Priya, who had once sided with Elias on a community project. The dialogue that follows captures the turning of it. His mindset into tangible leverage. Elias said, "I need $50,000 to pilot the routing software and hire 2 drivers." Sandra said, "That sounds ambitious. What collateral do you have?" Elias said, "I have a 5-year customer agreement with a local bakery and a ledger that shows consistent margins." Sandra said, "Agreements on napkins are not the same as contracts. How can you assure repayment?" Elias said, "I will stake my time. I will commit to weekly reports, and I will allow the bank to audit deliveries twice a month." Sandra said, "That is a lot of transparency. And who else is on your team?" Elias said, "Robert will manage operations, Julia will oversee drivers, and Priya will handle contracts." Sandra said, "What if a driver quits? What if fuel prices spike?" Elias said, "I have contingency funds and a metric system that tracks cost per kilometer and adjusts pricing nightly." Sandra said, "And the compass in your pocket? What is that?" Elias smiled and said, "It is my method." And then he explained the 3 questions the bank heard: measurement, not mysticism. Sandra said, "You talk like an analyst and a moralist in the same breath. This is unusual." Daniel said, "You need a guarantor." Elias said, "I will sign a personal guarantee and I will open a separate escrow account for initial revenue." Sandra tapped a pen and said, "You have conviction, but can you sustain stress?" Elias said, "I have practiced for years by choosing what to do under pressure and by giving 1% away when I had almost nothing, so that giving is not reactionary." Sandra looked at the ledger, at the notes from Robert, and finally nodded and said, "We will approve a pilot loan with milestones." This exchange had 9 turns, and each line carried both emotion and practical scaffolding. The sensory details of the room, the stiffness of the suit jacket, the chalk-dry throat of Daniel, and the metallic clack of coins in Elias' pocket all mattered to the decision. The proof, social evidence, came quickly when the pilot worked better than projected. 10 months later, the bakery, known as Santos Delivery, owned by owner Marta, reported a 30% reduction in late orders and an increase in repeat customers. Names keep this story anchored: Marta, the owner; Elena, Elias' mother; Thomas, the absent father; Maria, grandmother; Julia, operations manager; Robert, the mentor; Priya, the lawyer; Coach Harris, a leadership coach Elias hired later; and Professor Lee, an academic who validated the routing efficiency algorithm. Each of these people acted and reacted, shaping outcomes. The next major episode was a conflict about scaling. Elias faced a moral choice between taking venture capital money that required aggressive expansion or staying lean and community-focused. This became the crucible where mindset met money. The scene in his small office, where the floorboards creaked like a ship and the walls smelled faintly of glue from old posters, had another long dialogue. This one between Elias, his co-founder Julia, and a potential investor named Victor. Elias said, "We can scale rapidly, but I fear mission drift." Julia said, "Growth attracts talent, and that will make us competitive." Victor said, "Financial returns require speed and sacrifices on margins." Elias said, "I do not want to price out the small vendors we started with." Julia said, "You worry like a teacher." And Victor said, "You are not a teacher, you are an entrepreneur." Elias said, "Perhaps we can pilot a dual structure, a for-profit company and a non-profit arm funded by the for-profit." Victor said, "Your structure complicates investor returns." Julia said, "What if we set a measured growth plan with quarterly audits and a community board that has veto on strategic closures?" Victor said, "That is creative but less attractive." Elias said, "I would rather grow slower and keep our purpose intact than grow fast and lose the compass that points us." Julia said, "I trust you, but the board may push." Victor said, "Then I will withdraw." Julia said, "Not so fast. What about a compromise? A convertible instrument that triggers a cap on returns and guarantees a community fund." Elias said, "That could work if the cap is real and the fund is independent." Victor sighed and said, "Show me legal proof." The conversation had 8 exchanges and ended in a tense but constructive agreement. This moment shows the cost of maintaining principle. The cost was losing some money for speed and gaining something else, integrity, that would attract a different kind of investor later. Moments of tension like this ran through Elias' life, and each is important, so I will mark 3 of them and show their interior landscape. First moment of tension came when his mother Elena fell ill and creditors came calling. He had to choose between reinvesting in the company or paying for care. He remembers the smell of disinfectant, the thin, papery personal histories in the hospital folder, and the dull knock of the night nurse. He felt guilt and calculation entangled. He chose to pause all non-essential hires and allocate revenue for care, trusting that short-term sacrifice would not break the system. That choice cost 2 months of delayed expansion and taught him the rule that you cannot build an organization on denial of human need. This passage of pain is part of the price of discipline. Second moment of tension occurred when a driver named Carlos was caught diverting packages. The office smelled of stale coffee, and the driver room had an acrid odor of fried oil. Elias had to decide to fire or forgive. He spoke with Carlos in a room with a humming air conditioner and a cheap faux leather chair. Carlos said, "I was desperate. I had a sick son." Elias said, "Why did you risk the trust?" Carlos said, "I wanted to buy medicine. I did not know where else to turn." Elias said, "You betrayed customers and the company." Carlos said, "I am sorry. I can repay small amounts." Elias said, "Our work is built on mutual obligation, and your action broke that bond." Elias chose to terminate employment, but offered a path to redemption by helping Carlos find community resources and a part-time job referral. The moment cost him operational continuity but preserved trust. Third moment of tension was ethical when a large client offered a large contract that required ignoring smaller vendors in favor of scale. The office lights were low, the rain tapped against windows, and the contract pages slid like cold paper. Elias chose to accept only with a clause that protected a set of community vendors and a reinvestment percentage. The client balked, and the client named Victor again withdrew interest. The tension lasted 3 weeks and taught him that ethical clarity limits some doors but opens others. These 3 moments, each about 600 characters, are the friction that polish the mindset. Management and people issues became a set of principles that Elias wrote in a thin notebook that looked more like a diary than a manual. Rule 1. Measure relentlessly. Rule 2. Hire for values, not CV. Rule 3. Make giving structural, not optional. Rule 4. Delegate authority in ways that test character before skills. He applied these rules when he hired a regional manager, Nikhil, who came recommended by Professor Lee, and when he trained drivers under Coach Harris. The hiring stories include Thomas, the older mentor, Robert, who taught metrics, Julia, who led operations, Priya, the lawyer, Marta, the bakery owner, Nikhil, regional manager, Carlos, the driver, and Elena, his mother, who later advised on worker benefits. Each name carries an action, and each action shaped the culture. Health of mind became another section of his practice because the grind erodes even the most disciplined heart. He invested in emotional regulation practices and hired Coach Harris, a leadership coach who taught him to externalize stress through journaling and through a monthly retreat by a small lake where he would practice silence. The sensory memory of that lake matters. The smell of pine, the cold skin of morning fog on his face, the taste of black coffee at dawn, the sound of distant birds, and the softness of wet grass under his shoes. When he faced burnout, he did not push harder. He paused and reallocated tasks. He learned to set boundaries around decision-making and to bring in professionals to manage grief and stress. That decision to be deliberate about mental health protected both the company and his family life. Philanthropy emerged not as a PR move, but as a consequence of his compass rituals. He started a community fund that offered microgrants to small vendors named the Compass Fund. The river metaphor that runs through this narrative becomes explicit here. He compared money to water. Water can erode or it can irrigate. You can hoard it in a dam or you can create channels that feed gardens. He chose channels. The fund provided training to vendors like Marta and flexible credit to drivers and allocated 10% of profits to community grants. The river image recurs in his speeches, where he would say, "Plant seeds, not collect streams." The concrete impact was measurable. Within a year, 23 vendors reported increased sales and 6 drivers completed vocational courses. Names again matter. Thomas organized logistics for the fund, Priya ensured legal compliance, Professor Lee studied impact metrics, and Julia ran training days. Principles translated to numbers and to faces. Now, practical takeaways you can apply for your life. First, begin a 10-minute daily ritual where you ask the 3 questions that Elias asked. Write them in a small notebook and perform them consistently for 90 days. Second, adopt a measurement habit. Track one metric that matters weekly, not hourly. Third, designate a small portion of your resources to give away, publicly, not privately. This builds generosity muscle. Fourth, adopt a rule for hiring and for choosing partners that prioritizes values alignment and testing microbehaviors. These are not new ideas, but they are effective because they are simple and because they train your attention to what compounds. If you are watching this far, share in the comments, "My new habit is," followed by the small action you will start this week. Tell us if you will save 1%, donate one item, or write for 10 minutes each morning. By sharing, you create social accountability, and you help others who read your note to imagine change. When you post, you are not only promising yourself, you are adding to a public ledger of commitment, and that amplifies results. Now the epilogue, the part that shows how small shifts become real outcomes in time. 1 month later, the Compass Fund had its first round of microgrants. Names matter here because they show real people affected. Martha, the baker, used her grant to buy insulated boxes, reducing spoilage. Her repeat orders increased, and she hired a part-time assistant named Jose. Elias received daily notes from customers thanking the service for arriving on time. The company showed a 10% improvement in on-time delivery, and employee satisfaction scores rose slightly because the metric system reduced arbitrary decisions. These are concrete, small feedback loops that build momentum. 3 months later, the pilot loan was fully repaid ahead of schedule. Several drivers, including Carlos, who had been rehired on probation, completed an ethics training and contributed to a community workshop. Nikhil, the regional manager, initiated a discount program for school supplies for vendor families that served 50 children. And Priya successfully negotiated a legal structure that allowed a capped investor return, which later attracted a different set of investors comfortable with the mission. Community stories multiplied, and the Compass Fund reported an increase in vendor revenue by 15%. 6 months later, the company had matured into a model that blended profit and purpose. A local university invited Professor Lee to publish a case study, and a foundation awarded a grant that allowed expansion into 2 neighboring cities. The company supported a scholarship for Elena's grandchildren, and Thomas, who once left, became a donor who funded a driver's resilience program. The village of small vendors formed a cooperative that saved on procurement costs, and the town center that once had a single van now hosted a weekly market that drew more customers. The compass in Elias' pocket had become a symbol and a system. The rituals turned into policy, and the policies turned into community change. The long-term lesson is not that one man changed the world by himself, but that one disciplined mindset served as an organizing principle that others could replicate. Discipline turned into principle, principle turned into ritual, ritual turned into policy, and policy turned into legacy. Who you need to be to get what you want is the question I want you to leave with. Do you want to be someone who measures, who gives, who chooses direction over distraction? The answer is practical, not mystical. Start with the compass ritual. Start with 10 minutes and 1 metric and a public promise. If this story moved you, subscribe to see more narratives that translate principles into practices. Join the community, comment "My new habit is," and commit to a first action. Remember, you do not attract what you want, you attract what you are. If you are ready to change, say out loud, "My new habit is," and mean it, and then take one small step right now. The compass points not to a destination, but to the direction you choose. Subscribe for more stories that teach you how to build momentum and leave your mark.